During the Ming Dynasty, which spanned from 1368 to 1644, concubinage was a common practice in Chinese society. Concubines were women who were not legally married to their male partners but lived with them as secondary wives or mistresses. These women were often from lower social classes and were purchased by wealthy or powerful men. They were considered to be the property of their male partners and had few legal rights. The life of a concubine during the Ming Dynasty was marked by strict social hierarchy, gender roles, and expectations. While some concubines enjoyed relative comfort and wealth, others faced a life of servitude, abuse, and even death. The complex relationships between concubines and their male partners were also influenced by Confucian values, which emphasized filial piety, family honor, and social status. Despite the challenges, some concubines were able to carve out a place for themselves in Ming society. They often developed close relationships with their children and other female members of the household, formed social networks with other concubines, and even gained political power and influence. This paper will provide an in-depth examination of the life of concubines during the Ming Dynasty, including their social status, living conditions, relationships with their male partners, and their role in society. Through a careful analysis of primary sources and secondary literature, we will gain a better understanding of the complex and multifaceted experiences of these women in one of China's most fascinating historical periods. The brutal treatment of concubines in Ming Dynasty China. During the Ming Dynasty in China, 1368 to 1644, concubines were women who were taken into a man's household as secondary wives or mistresses. Although some concubines were treated well and had a relatively comfortable life, many were subjected to brutal treatment and harsh living conditions. One of the most brutal practices was the 3-inch golden lotus, or lotus feet tradition, in which young girls had their feet tightly bound to prevent them from growing beyond 3 inches in length. This practice was seen as a symbol of beauty and desirability, but it caused immense pain and permanent disability for the women who endured it. Concubines were also subject to physical and sexual abuse by their owners, and some were even killed if they failed to satisfy their owners or bear male hairs. They had very little legal status or protection, and their lives were completely controlled by their owners. In addition, concubines were often subjected to fierce competition and jealousy from other women in the household, including the owner's wife and other concubines. This could lead to even more mistreatment and violence. Uncovering the dark realities of concubine life in Ming China. One of the dark realities of concubine life in Ming China was the lack of agency and control over their own bodies. Concubines were often selected from poor families and sold to wealthy households, where they would have little say in their daily lives. They were expected to be available for sex at any time and were often subject to physical violence if they refused their male partner's advances. Many concubines suffered from sexually transmitted diseases or died during childbirth due to the lack of medical care and the dangerous conditions they were forced to endure. Another issue was the intense competition among the concubines themselves. In some cases, multiple women would be chosen to serve as concubines to the same man, creating a highly competitive and tense environment. These women were constantly vying for their male partner's attention and affection, often resorting to extreme measures to gain an advantage. This could include spreading rumors, sabotaging each other's pregnancies, or even poisoning their rivals. Furthermore, concubines were often subject to the whims of their male partners and their families. They could be easily cast aside if they failed to bear children or lost favor with their male partner. Many were forced to leave their children behind and return to a life of poverty after their time as a concubine ended. Overall, the life of a concubine in Ming China was a dark and often harrowing experience. While they were considered a symbol of wealth and status for their male partners, they endured a life of constant competition, abuse, and powerlessness. How concubines suffered in the quest for imperial favor in Ming China. To begin with, many concubines were forced to leave their families and live in the palace, often against their will. Once inside, they were subjected to strict rules and regulations that governed every aspect of their lives. They were required to be available for the emperor's pleasure at all times and were expected to produce male heirs as quickly as possible. Even those who did succeed in becoming the emperor's favorite faced a life of constant anxiety and uncertainty. They could be replaced at any time by a younger, more beautiful concubine, and were always at risk of falling out of favor and being punished. Overall, the lives of concubines in Ming China were marked by constant danger, competition, and exploitation. Despite their status as imperial consorts, they were often treated as little more than disposable objects, subject to the whims of the emperor and his court. The terrifying existence of concubines in the Ming Dynasty. Concubinage was not only practiced by the emperor and the nobility, but also by wealthy merchants and scholars. Some concubines were brought into a household as young girls, often sold by their families, and were forced to serve the man and his family until their death. Others were women who had lost their husbands or had been abandoned and turned to concubinage as a means of survival. The lives of concubines were often marked by jealousy, competition, and violence. They had to navigate complex power dynamics within the household as they competed for the affection and attention of their shared partner. Concubines who failed to please their master or who were deemed disloyal could be punished, beaten, or even killed. In addition to the physical and emotional abuse, concubines also faced health risks. They were at higher risk of contracting sexually transmitted infections and were often subjected to dangerous fertility treatments to increase their chances of bearing a son. However, it is important to note that the practice of concubinage was not unique to the Ming Dynasty or to China. It has been a common practice in many cultures throughout history and is still practiced in some parts of the world today. Nonetheless, it is important to recognize and condemn the exploitation and abuse that often accompany this practice. The chilling fate of concubines in Ming Dynasty court life. The lives of concubines were highly regulated by strict rules and protocols. They were not allowed to leave the palace without permission, and were constantly monitored by eunuchs who reported any misbehavior to the emperor. Concubines who disobeyed the rules or failed to produce a male heir were punished harshly. Punishments included beatings, imprisonment, or being sent to work in the palace's kitchens. Concubines who gave birth to a male heir were promoted to higher ranks and received better treatment. However, even these favored concubines were not immune to the dangers of court life. Jealousy and rivalries among the concubines were common, and some even resorted to poisoning or other means to eliminate their rivals. Furthermore, when the emperor died, the fate of the concubines was uncertain. In some cases, they were allowed to retire to a life of luxury. In other cases, they were forced to become nuns or were executed to prevent them from becoming a political threat to the new emperor. Overall, the life of a concubine in Ming Dynasty court was one of confinement, competition, and uncertainty. While some concubines were able to rise to high ranks and enjoy a comfortable life, many others faced brutal punishments or a tragic end. In conclusion, the history of concubines in the Ming Dynasty is a disturbing reminder of the exploitation and abuse of women in a patriarchal society. The practice of concubinage allowed wealthy and powerful men to amass vast numbers of women as their sexual and reproductive property, subjecting them to cruel treatment and dehumanizing conditions. While the Ming Dynasty may have ended centuries ago, the legacy of this practice continues to resonate in modern society, highlighting the ongoing struggle for gender equality and human rights. It is important to acknowledge the past and learn from it in order to create a better future where every person is valued and respected, regardless of their gender or social status. So that's it for today. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell button to get all the latest updates.